In this lesson, we're going to talk about operations with polynomials. So these operations, the first ones we're going to talk about are just our normal add, subtract, multiply, divide. One thing to keep in mind is our notation looks a little funky sometimes. So this first notation, notice it says f plus g of x. This just means that we add f and g. And same thing with subtraction, and multiplication, and even division. Now, one thing we do want to be careful of with division is that when we divide, we can't let g of x, which is the denominator, be 0. We'll talk more about division later, but for most part, we're going to work with addition, subtraction, and multiplication today. So we have a table on number 1, and they want us to find f plus g of -2. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the x is -2. Now, this is not my most favorite notation. I actually prefer the second notation, which says that we would take f of -2 and add it to g of -2. This shows that we have to do the parts separate and then add those y values together. So f of -2, again, this is a -2 is an x value. So we can see that f of -2 is simply 4. And then we can see that g of -2 is 5. So in effect, we're using that entire row right there. So 4 plus 5. And 4 plus 5, now that we have those y values, we can add them together and we get the value 9. So f of g of -2, so f plus g, sorry, of -2 is 9. Now what if we want to find g divided by f of 4? Well, same thing here. I prefer the notation that says that we take g of 4 and we divide it by the bottom, which is f of 4, making sure we keep it in the same order. So again, we go over to our table and we find where x is 4. There's x is 4, and we find our g value. So our g value here is going to be -1. So that means -1 goes in the numerator. F of 4 is 0, which means 0 goes in the denominator. And if you'll recall, when we divide a number by 0, this is undefined. If you were to try to type it in your calculator, you'd get a divide by 0 error. But one way to easily remember it is that 0 on top is okay, 0 on bottom is a no-no, okay? So that might help you remember when things are undefined if you don't have a calculator. Now, what if we have a graph? It's the same thing. We've done evaluating from a graph before, so now we're just going to do an operation from evaluating from a graph. So again, let's look at this in a different notation. So instead of saying g minus f, let's say g of 3 minus f of 3. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to where x is 3. So x equals 3 is right there. So everywhere on this line is where we're going to be looking. That's where the x values are 3. And we have to start with the g function. So the g function we can see is this parabola. And right there is where we have a value of 3 for x. And the y value is 1. So g of 3 is 1. F of 3, again, we go to the f function, which is the line. Find where the graph is at 3. So right there it's 3, and then the y value is 4. So 1 minus 4 is -3. And remember, order does matter when it comes to subtraction and division, as those are not commutative. Okay, what if I have f times g of 0? So f of 0 times g of 0. So again, we're going to go to where the graph is 0. So in this case, what x is 0 is right here, which means it's going to be all along the y-axis, and we're going to find a point. So let's see, if we look for f of 0, that's the line, and that point is right here, so that's the point 0, 1, times g of 0 is down here at -2, and 1 times -2 is just -2. So that's finding operations of a table or a graph for a function.